All right. Hello there, you, whoever you are. Nice of you to stop by. This is Jay Brown Yoga Talks podcast. My name is Jay Brown. And if you're listening to this right when it's being released, then it's only a day or two before Christmas. And I'm hoping that everything's going okay so far. Like, I hope the drive was okay, or the flight didn't get delayed, or you're not already fighting with your family, or, you know, if you're like me, you're not at home and you're trying not to eat too much. No, really, I do enjoy this time of year. Many of you who have been around over the years know that I always go to my in-laws in Virginia, and there have been tumultuous years where me and my father-in-law blew up Christmas in a fight about politics. And then over the last few years, though, we've all really settled into a very lovely time together. And I'm recording this the day before I leave. I'm going to leave tomorrow and head up there and hopefully try to shut off some. I've got like a little bit of work to do, but I'm really trying to make myself turn off some of that stuff for a little while. Like, it's going to be okay if I just take a day or two to not do it all, right? To just hang out with my family. I also know that this time of year can sometimes be rough for people. Maybe you don't have family to be around. Maybe you're by yourself, and maybe this time of year doesn't feel so special for you. And I just want to say that if that's the case and you're actually taking some time out of your life to listen to this, well, I really appreciate that, and I'm sending some love to you. My guest today is Michael Lear. I had the pleasure of sitting down with him here in Easton, Pennsylvania a few weeks ago, and I'm going to tell you about that. But first, I want to express my gratitude to everybody who reached out with your caring sentiments after last week. If you were here, I was in some considerable pain and was recording from my bed. I just want to let everybody know that I'm feeling much better. Thank you. The pain has subsided. I am fortunate to have a set of tools, and I am able to right my ship if I give myself enough space to do it. I just don't always seem to be giving myself that space. I'm working on it. You know, it's a pattern. Funny, anybody who's practiced with me knows that one of the things I stress most is this idea of setting boundaries and then working within the boundaries that you set. And most of you are probably yoga teachers listening to this, and you know we teach the stuff that we need the most, right? And I do it in all kinds of areas of my life, you know. But the areas that I'm not so good at setting the boundaries with right now, one is just work. I enjoy my work. It's fulfilling, but I can do too much of it. The other is sugar. I really am not very good at setting my boundaries with sugar. I'm some days I do better than others. And then the last one is the screens, which kind of ties in with the working, right? The screen time and the working. But I can do work when I'm not on screens too. So I guess that they're separate. So I'm saying that out loud because those are the areas I want to continue to put some special attention to set better boundaries in those areas, and then maybe I won't have to be recording in pain. So as I was saying, my guest today is Michael Lear, and I had not met Michael before. His name has come up a bunch. His name came up in two different places that are sort of unrelated in my life. One, I was having all these conversations with Ashtanga folks, if you recall, and I recorded a conversation with Guy Donahue, and Guy mentioned him to me. He said, "You live in Easton? Do you know Michael?" And I was like, "No, I never heard of him." And then I was here in Easton, and I was talking to some friends I know who are from around here, and they said, "Oh yeah, Michael Lear, he was like one of the first yoga teachers in Easton." I thought, oh, that's interesting. I want to hear about the history of yoga in Easton. So I reached out and he got back to me and I went and sat down with him and it was fun to touch base. You'll hear he has a background in Trager approach. I don't know if you know what Trager is. We talk some about that. And then he also has this Ashtanga influence and he has an interesting perspective. He's combining things that, in my mind, don't necessarily combine, but he's making it work. And it was interesting to pick his brain some. And I think that you will enjoy hearing it today. Before we do, I got a few things I want to mention. First, I don't know if you're on my email list. Are you? If you're not, you might get on that. You just go to the website and subscribe to it. But every once in a while, this time of year especially, we do these promotional offers. And, you know, if you've been around, you know I haven't been doing that on this show much. I haven't been doing like discount promo offers and stuff. But this in particular promo offer, it's kind of unique and special. And I'm mentioning it because we're doing this 40% off any of my on-demand video stuff. In particular, my online workshop. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but I have an online workshop, and you can get 40% off if you use promo code December40. And we usually only do those these days on the email list. But Josh said, hey, why don't we put it out to podcast folks? Because at the end of the year, not only will the promotion go away, but the price of the online workshop is going up some. That decision has been made. It's been where it's been for years and years, and we basically priced it like half as much as everybody else because I had this whole thing about I want it to be able to be accessible. I want people to be able to do it. So we totally underpriced ourselves for years and years and years and years. And I've got some exciting new things coming. So longer story short, the price of the online workshop is going up on January 1st. So if you were to take advantage of this 40% offer right now, before the 1st, that is like the lowest price you're ever going to get for it. So for whatever that's worth, online workshop and also my practice video DVDs and downloads, you can get 40% off any of those on-demand videos using promo code December40. And you can find that with all my stuff at jbrownyoga.com. Now, other than taking advantage of that offer, I want to also quickly, again, touch base with those of you who are listening who are running studios and still using Mind Body Online. And you've heard me say it before. You've heard me say that you should try KarmaSoft, today's sponsor. And maybe you thought for a moment you might look into it, but then I know what it's like. You got a million things going on at this center. It's like, are you really going to bother yourself with having to switch the software you're using to manage your studio? Well, listen, we're coming to the end of the year, and I'm sure that price has been hiked a bunch of times. And, if you haven't looked at KarmaSoft, I really want to encourage you to do so. It's the software that I used when I had a center. The owner, Rudy Senecal, he's been on the show before. You can go back and listen to the episode. We talk all about it, and he really does things different. And I think that it makes your job of running a studio more efficient and easier. So do yourself the favor. Go check out KarmaSoft. Go to karmasoftonline.com. Last thing is I got tour dates, and I want you to know where I'm going to be because it'd be very cool if you showed up. Doing Gentle is the New Advanced Easing the Pain 2020. And this is a 2-day intensive with me. And I really think this is the best way. If you want to compare notes or you want to learn about my viewpoint or just get some new tools in your tool belt, then this is without a doubt the best way to do that. I am going to be in London, England, January 11th and 12th. I'm going to be in Vienna, Austria, January 15th and 16th. I'm going to be in Berlin, Germany, January 17th and 18th. And then I'll be back in the States in Las Cruces, New Mexico, February 8th and 9th. I'll be in Sarasota, Florida, March 21st and 22nd. And I'll be in Austin, Texas, April 11th and 12th. And you can find out more about those events and register for any of them at jbrownyoga.com/tour. That's jbrownyoga.com/tour. Okay, I think that's good, you guys. I've got a bit of packing to do before tomorrow, so I will touch base with you on the other side. I'll tell you about who's coming on next week. Some other interesting things are in the pike. For now, though, let's do it. Let's go to downtown Easton, Pennsylvania, and listen to this conversation that I had with Michael Lear. All right, we are live with Michael Lear.
Hey,
man, in Easton, Pennsylvania.
Yes, we are. We're on Bank Street, South Bank Street.
South Bank Street. And I have to say, Michael, I've heard your name come up a bunch. As I was just telling you on my way in, I moved here to Easton 2 years ago. And, I told you also how there was sort of these, not strange, but auspicious circumstances that led me here.
Mm-hmm.
And I also mentioned that I knew Alicia from Easton Yoga. I taught there for a little while, and I read somewhere that you opened an Easton Yoga. Was it the same Easton Yoga or a different Easton Yoga?
No, I started that in, I guess it was 2001, the end of January. We opened, it was the Yoga Studio of Easton. And it was an offshoot of natural therapy center that I had here in Easton called Soma Health Potentials. And that was kind of born out of a call from some of my clients that just, offer yoga because there wasn't something happening. And I had worked on convincing my then teacher, Erica Salzer, who has Emmaus Yoga, to come into Easton. When her lease was up. She had Alive and Kicking back then and wasn't able to get the place, which was actually the Carl Stirner's Arts Building.
Okay.
Where you were just at.
Yeah.
Right? That there was a downstairs space that was available, and she came and looked at it, but they had literally just rented it out.
Huh.
So
2001 you opened? It's the same space, though,
Same
right?
space. It was a bike co-op in the front, and I had actually met Rob through a friend of mine who's now in Santa Barbara, who also taught there initially. Her name was Zirka. And I had the middle room, that large green room if it's still green.
It's still green.
Okay, I was there painting that. And there's a lot of...
Very tall ceilings.
Very tall, yep.
Kind of dark, but tall ceilings.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, all right, so that is wild, but did I read right that you grew up here?
I did. Born and raised on Cattell Street.
What?
Yep, and I went to March school. And
so wait a second. What was, because I joined the neighborhood association, and I've been picking the brain of the board members there who've been here for 30 years and learned all this stuff about Easton. Very historical town. Mm-hmm. One of the first places the Declaration of Independence was read out loud. I learned all this stuff about Easton. But I also heard tell that at an earlier time, Easton was kind of like a rough place. It wasn't a great place to live, maybe. It was a little bit of a rough town. Growing up, when I was 5 or 6 years old, I could walk from College Hill downtown. I went to the Boyd Theater, which is now a parking lot on 3rd Street. I used to see the Charlie Brown movies at the State Theater. I think I saw Planet of the Apes, Poseidon Adventure, all that stuff. But I could wander downtown as a 6 or 7 year old. Mm-hmm. Probably 5 keeps coming to mind. So we were pretty young when I had an older brother, so maybe that's how I got down. There was a Woolworths over there, and we'd go sit at the little, delicatessen bar kind of a thing with the red-capped stools that spun around, get a burger and fries. So that's what was going on when I was much younger. When the mall culture hit, there was absolutely a commercial vacuum in town. So it might have been there was probably a good decade or two where there wasn't a lot of business activity in town. In fact, probably through, mid to late 80s until there was that first attempt at a renaissance. So there's probably a good 20, I think it was 1973 when the Palmer Mall went in. Right.
And then that's what just caused this vacuum of activity downtown.
I see. Well, I heard that it used to be like an iron town, and then it was very depressed, and then, like you say, there was some renaissance that started, and then it seems to me like the downtown market, like you were just saying to me on the way in, like that seemed to me like maybe a turning point for Easton, right?
When people could come in, I think it was 2007. Was back from Sri Lanka, or 2007 or 8, and I remember moving into an apartment in the Circle. But it started to gain some traction and some momentum, and 500 people would show up, 1,000 people would show up. I'll put it. I mean, it was I think Megan McBride was still part of that. She was carrying the baton of the one woman that used to sit there and sell her vegetables from her garden, that kept it the longest continuous running farmers market in the country. And but I recall Salvatero's farm, which they still have vegetables there. They would bring in so much food. They got so busy they had to put them over by Crayola factory because they were blocking the traffic of the Circle. So people were like, wow, I can come into town and buy really good food. So I really feel like, in my personal sense, is that it was, nothing happens in a vacuum, but it was when people realized that was a key part of what was going on in Easton, that it got a lot more traction. And I love that fruits and vegetables were the tipping point.
Well, I guess that's one of its claim to fames, is that Easton's got this farmers market, like this big, longest running farmers market that you can go to every Saturday.
Yeah, it's a cool thing. It's nice, you see. People having a really good time. It's simple but genuine. Everybody's high vibe.
I found that, and I think it's a kind of a nice mix for me, because I grew up in the suburbs and then I lived in the big city my whole adulthood. And this does feel like a pretty good middle ground. Like I can walk 10 minutes up to Gola Park and be on a trail.
Oh, right. Yeah, on that lookout.
Or I can drive an hour and 40 and be in the city.
Right.
So it does feel like a bit of a middle ground. I can still get some decent brick oven pizza.
Yeah.
Yeah. But it's not like the same foodie thing like in Brooklyn or whatever, right? Uh-huh. But it's a good middle ground.
No, that's awesome. And I mean, I think, having access to those different things, but being able to come back and like legitimately unplug and decompress, because sometimes when you are in a busier, urban environment, sometimes even, you can, even when you unplug, you're still kind of like hyperactive or stimulated.
I think that was nice. Part of my motivation is I needed the change of pace. Like I always say, if I go outside in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, and I just stand on a corner and close my eyes, and I just sense what that feels like. And then I go outside my house in College Hill and I close my eyes and just sense it. There's a completely different frequency to the place that I'm in. And I think you either like jive with that frequency and it works for you or not. And then I needed a new frequency. So glad to be in Easton. And cool. Crazy to meet you, because when I've talked to people about yoga in Easton, your name has come up, because it seems to me like you were one of the earliest people who was sort of teaching here. I don't know. What was like yoga like in Easton? When did yoga first get to Easton? How did you get to yoga growing up in Easton? Okay,
my introduction to it was really out of, I was studying a neuromuscular therapy, the Trager approach. I got into it in 87 and was working towards my certification in late 80s, early 90s. And it was at trainings that I got introduced to yoga.
And I'm sorry to jump in, but I'm curious, like why did you get into Trager work in the first place? Why were you interested in that stuff?
Even a better story. I studied finance and international management in school. So that's my degree. But I also I minored in hypertension. So at age 22, I was diagnosed with high blood pressure. I had impressively high blood pressure, high cholesterol. I had chronic back pain, and I weighed about 40 pounds more than I do right now.
But you knew how to make money, huh?
That was it was in my head. And I was also, I was allergic to medicine. Oh. So painkillers, I had knee surgery, couldn't take all of the top tier painkillers. I took aspirin for that.
Wow.
Penicillin. So when I was given muscle relaxers, and I was like, wow, I'd rather have the pain. So my only out was I discovered, my cousin had gone to school with a woman in town here who practiced the Trager approach. And I went to her, and literally I've never stopped. That was May 13, 1987. I was 22.
And I've heard of it, but is that like trigger point work? Like say a little something about what trigger work is.
Okay, so trigger point is a Travell therapy, Travell's trigger point therapy. And what that basically did was you kind of cool the muscle and then you stretch, looking at the trigger point as the muscle spindle or the length receptor of the muscle belly. What Trager does is actually uses a kind of a nonviolent communication touch dialogue to have a conversation with the nervous system to make it feel safe, so it will let go of compensatory responses to injury that are like dysfunctional muscle holding patterns that were valid at a particular time but no longer, and that kind of disrupt normal function. And in that way, it's a lesson for the nervous system as opposed to a treatment for the muscles specifically.
That's really interesting to me. That's an idea that I work with a lot in practice, this idea that if you like push hard into a tight muscle, it won't release. But if it feels safe, then it can slide.
Right.
And the idea of creating a safe situation that's not too challenging to work from. Mm-hmm. It sounds like that we said nonviolent communication.
Well, it's also the other idea too is that central to it is the state of mind of the practitioner. So it's based on self-care, and Dr. Trager was a longtime meditator. He would drop into a state that was very neutral, equanimous, non-fixing. But like I can't give you a Buddha statue if I don't have one. I can't give you deep peace, light-free, fluid shoulders if I don't possess that for myself. So the minute I start efforting or trying, I'm imparting that through my touch. So we're taught to keep it fluid, free, and easy. And when those feelings, if I start to get a little tired, I'll step back, reconnect, and then come back in. So I just flood your nervous system with messages that are there to inform it of its natural or inherent state.
I mean, I think that applies to yoga teaching too, that like the sensibility of the teacher and the way their nervous system is firing off when they walk in the room and interact with people is all part of what is being exchanged.
Exactly. Yeah.
And you're only so good as you can kind of walk your talk.
No, dude, I'm teaching a yoga anatomy for a teacher training in Doylestown, and I start with my first hour and a half is the anatomy of consciousness, and it's all the frontier science about heart math, electromagnetic frequency of the heart, self-care as the community service, and you're the energetic template for what's in the room. So if you practice with integrity, and you walk your talk, then that sets the stage for everything. So you're so right on point with that. It's great that, that's where you're coming from.
Well, very interesting. And certainly, I think, is across different modalities that would be true. All right, so you got into Trager work and it helped you. It helped, you can't take painkillers. You got to figure something out.
Yeah. So that's where I learned. I became aware of the Yoga Journal VHS tapes.
Yoga Journal, was that Rodney Yee?
Rodney Yee, Patricia Walden.
Yeah.
90. So it was like 91.
Yeah. I've heard those ones before the tapes.
Yeah. I flopped around in my living room, knocking stuff off of the coffee tables. But that was yoga for me.
And that's the 80s.
That was early 90s.
Early 90s.
Early
okay.
91, 92. And then I got turned on to Ganga White and Tracy Rich's Flow series, and both of those guys were Ashtangis back in the day, and then they had this 64-minute tape that just blew my mind because I couldn't really. I'm like, wow, this is like so hard for me, and I was reasonably fit.
Yeah.
Here's this wiry guy doing all this stuff.
Was it like a primary series?
Pretty much, yeah. It was pretty much, that was where they were coming from. But they're the White Lotus Foundation out of Santa Barbara.
Okay.
And then how I found, so I'll fast forward, I wound up in Asia for a long time, came back, Southeast Asia. When I came back, some friends of mine said, hey, that tape was based on Ashtanga. You should go see Erica at Alive and Kicking.
Oh, okay. I've heard of Erica. She was an early Ashtanga person here in the Lehigh Valley, right?
Yep. She had done, she was working with Larry. What was Larry's? Larry Schultz.
Okay.
At It's Yoga in San Francisco. She had trained out there, came back around. So she was my first Ashtanga teacher per se, but I was doing an Ashtanga-based practice for about 6 or 7 years prior to meeting her.
I see. And that Ashtanga-based practice was here in the Lehigh Valley or in Asia?
It was in my living room, and then while I traveled,
using the tapes, right?
Yeah, well, and I learned it, but then I committed it to memory.
Well, that was the beauty of Ashtanga. Was once you learned it, you could just do it on your own. That was the whole point, I think. I took that from that school as well. That idea of self-practice.
Yeah.
All right, so you're doing your own self-practice using the tapes for a while. Then you find a teacher here doing more of a Mysore room?
It was actually lead classes.
Okay.
And then that led to... I found David Swenson, Nancy Gilgoff.
Okay. And when you say that, you mean you came up with their books or their videos, or did you go see them? Because you mentioned the West Coast. Do you spend time there too?
I do, but that comes a little bit later.
Later, okay.
Yeah. No, I wound up, I did David Swenson's primary series adjustment clinic, or that training a couple times. I've done a second series practice training. I've done Nancy Gilgoff's primary and second series adjustment clinics back in 2000, I think with her, like 1, 2, and 3.
It's really interesting that you just mentioned that you took these adjustment clinics. I don't know, have you been paying attention to the New York Times article that came out last week?
Yeah, absolutely.
So that adjustment workshop or hands-on adjusting has gotten a lot of press of late.
Mm-hmm, sure.
And I've had a number of these conversations, like what things were like back in earlier times. And at that time, that was really, I was in New York City. I started in like 93 at the Jivamukti Center.
Yep.
And so I remember that Ashtanga really hit, like it became like the big craze. And so did you start to identify as an Ashtanga practitioner at some point? Like, did you think of it in that way? Do you know what I mean? Because it did have like, Pattabhi Jois was considered the guru. Did you come up against that? Did you meet Pattabhi Jois?
I did it when Eddie brought him to the Puck building in 2000 and 2001. I was at both of those sessions. And I was really, since the practice had been familiar to me through the Ganga White, Tracy Rich videotape when I took Erica's first class, I'm like, wow, I know this. I didn't know the whole sequence. There were some details, like you can get into Marichyasana D and some of the deeper expressions of some of those sections of the sequence. And I guess I was an Ashtangi, but I was not so much in the Mysore culture because there was no Mysore in this area. It was lead classes. And what I found fascinating about adjustments is that I'd been a body worker by that time for about a decade or so, and I'd already had my way of reaching a nervous system, so I could. Yeah,
see, I'm thinking that you started out by telling me about this non-violent touch between you and people in Trager work, but I remember the early days of Ashtanga, and those hands-on adjustments were not. They were violent. They were quite strong.
Well, with what David Swenson and Nancy Gilgoff taught, they didn't do the leaning in.
I see.
David Swenson, I recall, was just very. Is a very aesthetic practice, and he taught a few adjustments for each posture, but then we would move through them. So he was emphasized more the leading, and then some adjustments you could do while you're guiding a class.
I see.
Nancy Gilgoff was taught by Pattabhi, or had a different experience. I think each teacher went in with a different ability, so they received a different transmission, if you will. So she had a slightly different approach to things. But interestingly enough, it wasn't, I have to say, I don't have a history of strong adjustments. In Asia, I studied with Prem Carlisi, and this was in Sri Lanka. Heather Radha, his partner, and the same type of thing. I've never, aside from maybe one flow class in New York City where someone saw I was flexible and came in and took me down too fast. It didn't follow my rate of lengthening. Like I can kiss the floor, but I went too fast through my range, and I had my back pulled out a little bit. That was probably the only time that I felt like I was like over adjusted. But not so, and that wasn't necessarily in the Ashtanga culture per se. So, although I've been an Ashtanga teacher, I haven't had those types of experiences directly.
I see, but have you ever made any trips to Mysore?
I haven't. Interestingly, in 2004 when I left Eastern Yoga to go to India, and I was going to sit some Vipassana.
Okay, so you went in 2004. Is that what you just said?
That was my first trip to India. Mm-hmm. And I was going to sit some Vipassana and then go down to Mysore. And I got as far as Goa. And I wound up at Purple Valley before it was Purple Valley.
Wow.
And it was amazing. I was in the drop-in center, and there were 2 people doing classes, or 2 people in each class. There were 15 people in class. I was getting crazy good adjustments and a lot of attention. And I'm like, this is why I came. Mm-hmm. And it was, their names elude me right now, but I think...
I went to India in 1998.
Oh, wow. All right.
And I traveled all around, and mm-hmm. I ended up in Goa at the end. But it was a real trip because I had spent all this time, like, traveling in like Puri and these like smaller, like not touristy places so much. I did not go to the Taj Mahal or anything. Like, it was like really off the beaten path. And we ended up in Goa, and it was like MTV beach party scene with like raves all night long,
Yeah, right.
But I ended up at that place, whatever became Purple Valley. I don't think it was called Purple Valley, something like that, but maybe slightly different.
Right.
I went there and I talked to someone. I just asked if there was a place I could use to practice in the morning, and they let me use a space for free.
Oh, awesome.
So I had a little bit of experience there. So that's interesting. So you didn't end up going to Mysore. Me neither. I kind of went there and saw, and I looked, and it was like a bunch of people who looked like they were from New York. And I was like, and I didn't go, So you just avoided it, and you already had a practice.
I had a practice, and I came for some insights into my practice, and the teachers that were there were fabulous, and I thought I was getting what I needed.
You didn't go to find your guru.
I know, but in Vipassana you don't have a guru. You do, much like it's like you practice, and the stuff starts to you inform yourself. So that wasn't my journey.
You were never of that mind on board, but there was certainly quite of a lure or cult feeling in the Ashtanga world, at least when I was exposed to it early on. Did you feel that? Did you have a sense of that, or you just were doing your own thing? And
no, absolutely. I think when Patabi came to New York City, if you've seen Ashtanga New York, right, or just there's a room and there's people coming in, and there's this. I don't know, it's something to witness, people just following this particular practice. Right?
And it was big. I've had several other people on this show talk about those particular events at the Puck building. It was like hundreds of people.
Yeah.
Annika Lucas came on and told us about being sexually assaulted in those workshops.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, that's one of the specific instances that have been cited.
Okay.
But again, there was hundreds of people in the room.
Yeah, there's no way you're like extroverted. You're kind of doing your practice. There's... people all around. So, God knows what,
But it was going on. That's the crazy thing.
Well, yeah, it's really unfortunate that those types of things do occur. And, I would think that in all of the touch therapies, you kind of hoping that people are practicing with integrity or showing up with integrity, leading with integrity, and not, leveraging that dynamic, to... create such a circumstance.
Well, that's a conversation we can get to. I think the conversation is around consent nowadays, and whether or not there is consent, and is it okay for a teacher to just assume that it's okay for them to do something with someone's body because they showed up to their class.
Right.
But all right, so you do start teaching. When do you start teaching?
When did I start teaching?
Yeah.
I started teaching in 2001.
Okay, that's right. You opened the center.
I opened up,
and you were teaching Ashtanga practice.
I was teaching David Swenson's 45-minute sequence. Okay. Is what most people could access. I did have a Wednesday night class for most of my clients, and I had people with sciatica, post-laminectomy, cervical laminectomy surgeries, people that I was working with in my bodywork practice. That was my largest class. So I used the Ashtanga as a therapeutic tool.
But were you doing jump back sun salutations with folks with those conditions?
Oh my God, you would not do that.
That's right. That's what I'm saying, though, because Ashtangas tend to be really strict, right?
Yeah, I guess so. Since that wasn't how I learned it, to me it's crawl, walk, run.
Right.
You want to practice in a way that when you're in Shavasana, you like who you were, towards yourself while you practiced. You feel like you've explored your edges sensibly, but you didn't sit there and go, oh crap, I pulled this, right? Because you want to show up the next day and the next day. And if you can just bring yourself into greater harmony and alignment with your practice and then go out and live at a higher vibe, to me, that's more the goal. You've heard, flexibility doesn't guarantee happiness, right?
No.
Nor does strength or wealth. It's about an internal process and finding an alignment and a connection with yourself that's going to start that. So.
All right, so you opened a center in Easton in 2001.
Yep.
And do you remember how many classes a week was that?
When I first opened, it was 4 classes a week.
That's right.
And I had about 35 people over the course of the week showing up. I ran it until about, I guess, July or August, and then my business partner at Soma Health Potentials and I decided to close the business. He went to Thailand to study Thai massage, and I was going to go to India my first trip. Right. But what happened was my flight date out of the U.S. was September 11th, 2001, out of Newark. And I never got on that plane, but I had just spent 4 months giving all my bodywork clients away and handing off. I handed my yoga studio to a woman that had worked at Nature's Way, who wound up, getting it to Rob. Rob connected with Mitty, and then it turned into that. And I came back into that situation as the yoga person.
I see.
So it came back to me.
No longer yours, but
I gave it away, and it came back.
Isn't that interesting? Well, crazy that.
And then it turned into more of a center.
Scheduled on that day. I was at the Omega Institute on that day.
Oh, wow, okay.
Doing a program there, and then I went back 2 days after, but that was a real shock point.
It was, for the planet, for sure.
Yeah, especially for those of us who lived around here.
Yeah.
Okay, so you're holding it down in the early 2000s, but at some point it seems like you left.
I did. While I was in, let's see if I can keep this short. Before I opened up Easton Yoga, I mentioned I spent time in Southeast Asia. So I had been through Cambodia as one of the countries that I was in, and was sensitized to the situation there, where there was a lot of landmine victims, and there was also a lot of children with polio. And interestingly enough, the Trager approach, when Dr. Trager discovered that, he was working a lot with post-polio sequelae in his neighborhoods. So I was sitting there thinking, wow, the Trager approach would be ideal for addressing the trauma of stepping on a landmine, maybe phantom limb pain, and then working with these children. So this notion of working in that kind of a context was planted. That seed was planted then. When I went to India in 2004 just to regroup, and again, I'm a committed Vipassana meditator, so I was focused on that. And the tsunami hit while I was in India.
Wow.
And on my way back home from India, I was traveling through Southeast Asia, and I was traveling back through Cambodia to see if my idea would get some traction there to work with physical therapists there, because I was looking at the Veterans International Center. And as I was traveling back through Southeast Asia, everybody said, hey, you should go to Sri Lanka. You should go to Sri Lanka, take this idea to Sri Lanka. And so long story really short, I came back. I had a particular epiphany before I came home. I came back and I said, hey, Rob, I'm going to go to Sri Lanka in 5 weeks. And I was just gone for
what was the epiphany, though? You skipped right over the epiphany.
Okay,
what was
so
the epiphany?
And I basically I woke up having this dream of a white building by a turquoise blue ocean. And I was like, oh, I'm going to Sri Lanka to find a hospital by the sea. And the night before I had that dream, I wrote in my journal, everybody says I should go to Sri Lanka. What do? I woke up, I had that dream, I drew the image in my journal, and then within 3 days in Sri Lanka, I found Navajivana through the Ashtanga center that I landed at. That
It ties in.
Yeah. I basically stayed at Rocky Point or Ashtanga Lanka. The owner of that property had been there. He's from Mount Shasta, but he had been supporting this rehab center in Tongal down the road.
And let me guess, it's a big white building next to the ocean.
It is. And my next 10 years revolved around acting on that dream.
See, that's just like the story I told you before we started about me getting the house here.
Exactly. That's why I
it's
I
like
love
at a
that.
certain point, you hit these like crossroads or inflection points in your life. And I've talked about it at that time on this show. People who've listened to the show for a long time heard me like crying in the intros, talking about how in a certain moment, if I dropped inside myself deep enough, there's like a sort of place of knowing or like a intuitive dialogue happening with the forces that be, and there's a momentum, and life's momentum picks up and kind of helps you in the direction.
Yeah. Well, I think, you come with how to access that is to have the courage to kind of surrender. Like, you were really open to, wow, here I got some momentum here. But you explained, you stayed curious, you stayed in the game, you kind of wandered into some unknown territory. And I think that's what is it? There's an Amelia Earhart quote that courage is the price that life exacts for granting peace. Right?
Well, I like that.
It's a cool one, but that's exactly what, when you were telling that story, I'm like, this guy leans in, he goes for it. So,
well, but it's interesting too, because like when you started telling your story about you had a dream, that's why I kind of like there's a voice in my head that, like the woo or like, oh, it's one of those airy kind of people, but you don't come across like that to me. I'm certainly always been a kind of cynical, pragmatic-minded person, but even from a pragmatic standpoint, I have to be honest with myself in the way that life happens. And I've often said this, that there's an element of magic, and I don't think it's a naive thing to admit that, and to allow for there to be this kind of unknown or uncertainty thing that we tap into that tells you to go to Sri Lanka.
Right. Well, no, I mean, there's some really, and measurable, extraordinary organizing qualities of, the cosmos, if you will. I mean, if you look at a lot of the frontier science, and I can get into a lot more stories, with the work that I did in Africa, but, to stay on point with the conversation.
Well, I appreciate that thing, because it seems like you and me, we could go very far afield, very easy.
Yeah.
But it seems to me that this time in Sri Lanka, you actually did get a chance to do what you had this bit of vision of, was bringing some of this work to populations that would normally get it.
Right.
Right?
Yep. It was, I worked with a physical therapist, and just, not to change what they did, but to enhance their treatment protocols based on some of the really efficacious qualities of the work. They were just masterful physical therapists. They did really great work. They worked very hard, skilled at what they did. The two techniques together created a synergy that they were able to take care of themselves better, treat more effectively and more efficiently. So I did that for a few years, and then that turned into work with another international relief group and stuff. But I kept going back to Sri Lanka through 2014.
All right. Well, what made you come back to the States?
Another story. So I was teaching at Ashtanga Lanka, and I was also Kathy Cooper and Jacob Hamworker were doing the primary season. I would do the beginning part of the season. Then I worked at an Amman resort that was there as well. So I was their yoga teacher and body worker in residence. And it was my intent to, move there. But one of the things is that the proposal that I had fell outside of the then category of wellness centers in Sri Lanka, and so that particular idea didn't take traction or didn't get traction. So in 2014, I came back.
I see. And you said you were teaching Ashtanga. At that time, was it a Mysore practice, or was it still led classes like you did originally?
No, at Ashtanga Lanka, it was Mysore.
I see.
Yeah.
Because that does seem like it's a different ball game in a way.
Yes and no. I mean, I find that, if yoga is the withdrawing of the senses, then, being in a led class, you're by default extroverted because you need to know where you're going, right? And most of your attention is not, going to your meniscus or your lateral collateral ligament. It's like, well, what's that person up to, or am I, in sequence? So as I, did the leg classes, there's a certain dynamic, but what made me really want to move towards Mysore is that when I would throw in a Mysore practice at Easton Yoga on a Wednesday night as a surprise, nobody could get themselves through the sequence. Mm-hmm. And I'm like, I'm not empowering people. They've been coming for years and they still haven't committed the sequence. They were coming regularly, but there's something different when you learn the choreography.
That's it. I appreciate what you just said. You put your finger on something for me, which is there's a difference when you're like leading people through something, and maybe you take them through a great thing and they deposit it in a wonderful place afterwards and they keep coming for years. And that's different than someone really learning a skill set like on their own. Like we said earlier, like that's the thing that I appreciated about the Ashtanga system was that element of self-practice. Right. I originally got that from that where, I know how to do a practice by myself at home.
Yeah.
And you can go to yoga classes for years and years and not necessarily feel that.
It becomes a different ball game at that point. I think it becomes more intimate and you start to realize that it's your tool for your own learning and your own personal growth. It's not someplace that you go to. It's just that self-empowerment piece. So when I had the opportunity to do that, it also allowed me to be an effective body worker in that context too. And having worked with trauma populations, and I've since been through a lot of trauma.
If you are hearing this message, then you're listening to the free version of Jay Brown Yoga Talks. To hear the rest of our conversation, please subscribe to Podcast Premium at jbrownyoga.com/premium.